Being Reagan land, I got an advance copy through my media connections of the new Rick Perlstein book that covers the Carter administration. I talked about it a bit before on here, and it's very good. I just finished 19. It's divided in years, and I just finished 1977, and oh man, I got my hands. I'm rubbing them together. But already there's been a lot of great stuff, and what's really cool about Perlstein is that I think more than anyone, he understands the real dialectical dynamic, even if he isn't really a dialectician, and he's like he has a liberal sensibility, and his narrative is evolutionary without being fully three-dimensional. But he definitely gets that there is like a conflict driving the emergence of like the Republican Party as we understand it. Like, we got here through a process. It's like it's true to say like, oh, these are the same Republicans they've always been, but that's also obscures the fact that over the years they've changed. It's like a ship of Theseus thing. They fused and shifted, and it's the same people pursuing the same political goals. See, that's the important thing, is that the real base of power of the Republican Party, America's capitalist class, has not changed. What's changed has been the culture that changes within the economy have produced, that requires the Republican Party, which is a political institution and has to reflect some sort of will of the people in some way to be legitimate as a political institution in a putative democracy. So they have to reflect the frustrations and alienations of their voters as neoliberalism immiserates them. I'm talking, of course, about, from the middle class and lower Republican voters, including upper middle class, because people point out, oh, a lot of these Trump voters, they're not economically insecure. They have a lot of money, but the thing is it's not necessarily even your actual immiseration. It's the fear of immiseration, the fear of falling, as Barbara Ehrenreich said. Apparently, the rich people who like Trump the most are the ones in congressional districts that have the most poverty. But are still, segregated. So like white poverty, places in like Appalachia, in the Midwest, that have been hammered by deindustrialization. And they still are doing well, so you can't say that they're miserable, but their neighbors are doing poorly, and their kids they know are going to do worse than them. So there's anxiety even if there isn't actual immiseration. So the conditions on the ground for everybody who hasn't been at the very top of the distribution of income in this country over the last 40 years have been dog shit. Either you have lost it significantly and materially, or you fear losing it, both of which create alienation from America, the project of America. And that alienation has to go somewhere. And the job of the Republican Party is to keep it reactionary, to keep it fixated on cultural demons, cultural spirits brought up by the conjuring wand of the manufacturing of consent. Immigrants, minorities, communists, whatever, abortion providers, cultural Marxists. And that's been because things have gotten worse, and the Republican Party has to reflect that. And what Perlstein gets is that that reality of a widening gap between the commitment to the project of America, between the people who run the Republican Party and the people who vote for the Republican Party, has led to a cultural shift within the Republican Party towards the sort of blood and soil, anti-intellectual, tub-thumping populism of Trump. But it's not just culture changing. Significantly, it was resolving a conflict in the Republican Party between the internationalist wing, which is Wall Street, which was embodied by Eisenhower beating Taft at the '52 convention, and then Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller being the avatar of that Wall Street republicanism that saw its interest aligned along an international line because they were the capitalists who had the most information, right? Because you can never say that the ruling class rules by their own interests, for their own interests. They rule for the perception of their own interests. And usually those are very close because they have a lot of information and power, and that gives them the tendrils to recognize the terrain more than us schmucks who don't have that kind of coordinated intelligence gathering capability. So they have the most information, which means that they can control the situation more, but it's not total. There's a gap, the Dunning-Kruger thing that's inside every institution and person. But they were closer to knowing the score. They were closer after World War II, looking at the global economy and the Soviet Union and say, this is not going to be a military conflict. We're going to win by creating a new dominant economic model that will be hegemonic. We will replace the patchwork exploitative system, extractive system of European colonialism, and we will replace it with a world system of raw production extraction in the third world leading to consumption in the first. That's what we're going to build, and that requires standing up the economies of all our former enemies and infusing them with capital, and eventually helping them establish their own competitive industrial economies to compete with us, because they needed to be strong, because otherwise they would be defeated. They saw that vision. But there were other Americans who ended up getting represented by Goldwater and then Reagan, often thought of as the Sunbelt Cowboys, who won the battle for the soul of the Republican Party. Those guys were local manufacturers mostly. You're talking about a regional powerhouse. He mentions the Allen Bradley Company in Milwaukee, a perfect example. It's a local like industrial supply company that is also one of the premier funders of race science. Charles Murray got a ton of money from them. They have their own think tank that's trying to prove the racial superiority of white people. And they've spent millions of dollars over the years on the kind of direct mail grassroots stimulation that led to the creation of that movement. Robert Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society, was a small local candy manufacturer in Massachusetts. The Knott's Berry family, who now have a theme park in Orange County, and were like one of the four families that basically monopolized agriculture, cash crop agriculture in California in the 20th century. Another reactionary funder and font. And that spoke to that middle class who didn't have that. They didn't have the interests. They were being exploited by Wall Street. They didn't have interests in common Wall Street. And so they were actually, their real interests were opposed to the broad category of capital, but they didn't know that. Because they couldn't see the one in front of them because of the ideology that they had. They couldn't see the near exploiter, but they could see the far one, and they hated him. And so the near exploiter, these new right guys who ended up becoming, from Young Americans for Freedom and from the Goldwater campaign and then to Reagan, who provided the other pole, the pole that said, we don't need this international bullshit. We don't need to accommodate. And what that also meant is we don't have to accommodate to culture shift, which is why Wall Street liberalism was more socially liberal, because it knew the larger game was capitalism versus communism. They knew that was the real stakes because they were international in their outlook. And that meant that when there's discontent along racial lines, you have to do something about it or you will undermine yourself against your enemy. The nearsighted small producers didn't know, if they were unable essentially to perceive that level. They couldn't even see that dimension of reality because they're too focused on their own piggish local consumption. And they said, no, we confront the Soviet Union and we destroy anyone who tries to undermine our culture. And that became the real argument. And by the time Pearlstein's talking, when Reagan goes from being close, almost getting Ford's nomination in '76 and then getting the nomination in '80, he's describing the moment when that bipartisan neoliberal consensus slams down, right? When, the broader political economic questions that used to be the domain of the political parties are no longer going to be on the political table because neither one of us are going to mention them. Neither party can now talk about stuff like deindustrialization, trade debt, or trade deficits, because To be a world reserve currency in the post-Bretton Woods system, you have to be a consumer and not a producer industrially. It doesn't work the other way. We have to have a trade deficit, and a big one, to float the dollar, because that's what makes the dollar circulate. That's the capillary action of the vascular system of the world economy, where the dollar is the reserve currency. We have to run a trade deficit, which means we have to deindustrialize. And neither party will argue about that. And they didn't for years. So what filled the void was culture. And culture filled the void completely. And then you have more secure white people, the white people who are less touched personally by the immiseration caused by deindustrialization. They have essentially the luxury to pursue social liberalism and claim that social liberalism will solve the misery of our lives, because they can't name the real cause anymore. Nobody can name the thing. Nobody can name the thing. We can only pretend to have a cultural response to it that could make the difference. It's all snake oil. The thing is, some people are aware they're selling snake oil, and some people don't know they're selling snake oil. That's the real difference. That was the fight in the Republican Party. The internationalists knew they were selling snake oil. The local producers thought it was real stuff, that it really cures your ails. That's the difference within these parties. Because the real question can't be answered. Because we need to run a huge trade deficit to keep this thing, this fucking global thing coming, and most importantly, keep this thing flowing with us in the driver's seat. Because that MMT shit, that's technically true right now. It's just describing events, as long as the dollar is a reserve currency. Because we need to build the fucking military. Because we're the cops. We're the head of the octopus, and we need to have we direct the military arm, the police arm. So we have to be able to run huge deficits, and we also have to have a population that can buy things, because we're the consumer of last resort. So we can't do it. We can't stop spending or tax it. Or we can't stop spending money on the military, and we can't stop with spending money directly or indirectly through quantitative easing and through government programs, putting money into people's hands and credit into people's hands so that they can keep buying. Credit being the important thing. It's all just credit to keep the system going. And so social liberals have the cultural position and social position, and due to their wealth, due to their holding on to that fragment of middle class wealth that we're still hanging on to, that's slowly shrinking. This iceberg of post-war wealth that went to the white middle class mainly, and is now slowly shrinking. And people still holding on to some, and the people holding on to more are the liberals. And so they have because they have institutions like colleges that sort of launder their continued at the top, their continued role in exploiting, right? Like, they're exploiters, and they know it. And you go to college to sort of soothe yourself of feeling bad about it. And that leaves you, coming out of the end, liberal, socially. If you don't go to college, if you're on the bottom, if you're being exploited, well, then you don't have really a lot of guilt to assuage in the first place. And then you don't go through the process. And so you are more likely to blame cultural elements, especially if there's a party that exists to convince you that there are cultural explanations for this, and that blame other people for things. Because you're trying to blame somebody for why you're mad. The liberal isn't trying to blame anybody. A liberal is trying to assuage guilt. Those are the two poles of motivation for politics. The liberal wants to not feel guilty. The conservative wants to blame somebody. And so the Republicans are there to have scapegoats at a cultural level for them to go to, and that's why they gravitate towards there. Liberals want to feel virtuous, and therefore going for the underdog makes them feel better, and it makes them feel like they deserve their wealth now. And what happened with the Republican Party, as Pearlstein points out, is that as economics fell away as a thing you could actually talk about when you're running for anything, and got filled with culture, that meant that the party itself filled with people who cared about culture. Because the people who care about culture, they're producing people who don't have that old understanding. They don't understand that these things are just to rile up the rubes. They don't understand that this is supposed to be rhetoric, because they're learning, they're seeping the same culture that everyone else is now absorbing, that all emanates from the alienation caused by deindustrialization, cutting off growth for the American working class. And so over time, the party itself becomes taken over by those people, the true believers. And now what we see with Trump is this, like his war with the deep state is a war with the now totally triumphant lumpen reactionary hicks, basically, over the remaining shell of establishment Republicans who understand that they're in a global fucking system. We are in a global system, you dumb hicks. We can't bring the jobs back. You have to give people bread and circuses. What are you doing? But guys like Trump and the people who follow Trump, to one way or another, they don't understand that. They think that like the capitalism is discrete economies, and that America needs to compete against the other discrete economies. Not that capitalism is monopolizing and totalizing, and that there is no separating these. There's no separating us from China. There's no separating us from Europe, or Mexico, or anybody else. There's only facilitating the flow. But because we don't talk about that to people, and no actual conservative voters think that's what's going on, they think we're in a battle between states. They vote for people who also believe that, and now they run everything. And they're in a civil war with the remaining institutional memory of the bureaucrats, who are more connected to the data and less connected to the ideology than anybody in the system, still knows to be necessary. And that's why Trump got in there, and he immediately folded on everything, because that establishment bit back. But now, over time, we're seeing that the pressure is mounting, because that's the center of gravity of the Republican Party. And like that's the kind of thing that you kind of hope could have happened in reverse with Bernie. He gets in there, and you've got the true believers. But now, you know, the idea being that now it's believing that seeing through their lie, as opposed to the Republicans, who are just taking seriously the propaganda of the upper ranks. And that's because at the base, the Democratic Party could theoretically make a egalitarian, anti-capitalist argument, which is impossible for the current Republican Party to do. Capitalism is embedded in its DNA. The argument, the debate between the populists and the establishment is just what that means. It's an information question. It's not ideological. And I would say that the establishment ones understand the nature of capitalism more than the nationalists and the populists. So they're dumber, technically. Even if they don't like capitalism, and that's good, they really think, no, it's just this type of capitalism, and that we can get a good capitalism if we whiten it up. They have less information, or they're dumber, and it's a combination of both, and they reinforce each other. They're dumber conservatives than the establishment ones, who understand that this is a global system, and you have to manage flow. And that means cultural change is going to happen, and you have to diffuse it by giving cultural grievance a vent.